Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast. We are here with another episode in our Critically Thinking series. And this is a really important one, and it's global news, probably the biggest story right now that we want to critically think about. And that is critically thinking about leaving Afghanistan. And I am here with my fellow co-host, Jeswin Thomas. Jeswin, how's it going, sir?
It's going well. I'm honestly excited to kind of talk about this. I don't know if excited is necessarily the right word, but just like you said, sometimes it may not be easy to have critical conversations, but that still means, we shouldn't avoid it. We should still do it regardless of what that topic is. So I think it's an important one to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. And just for those of you listening, today is August 31st of when we're recording this. And so I know with topics like this, you might be listening to this episode 2 days later, and the news is going to be completely changed, and there's going to be a new development. But, we've been tracking this story, and I think like the whole entire world has for several weeks now. And obviously, if you've lived in this country for the past, 20 years or more, you've been just exposed to war. And so this is so important. And so Jeswin, I love the fact that we've been talking about these polarizing topics, and this has actually become a polarizing topic. Wouldn't you say?
Sure. Absolutely. I think, there's so many different things that surround this in terms of that decision to leave, right? Was it right? Was it wrong? Timing, the way that we did it. So there are so many opinions out there. And once again, those opinions are going to be in the body. So it's definitely pertinent to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we've kind of had a couple episodes on some various polarizing topics, and we're here not just to sway you on one way or the other, but really to have more of a critically thoughtful approach to some of these subjects. So do you want to remind our listeners maybe our framework of how we actually critically think through things?
Yeah, once again, many of you might be familiar to this, but how we've been trying to tackle each of these topics has been to first understand what's the idea or question. And today we're going to be tackling, leaving Afghanistan. That is our idea or question we're trying to answer. Two, we're going to talk about what are the two or three or more different opinions that can be shared on it. Typically, we've done, two different opinions here, but there can be more. So if you apply this framework elsewhere, you might be able to use that. Three, underneath each opinion, what are the assumptions that go into giving that opinion some teeth or some credibility? And in conjunction with that, are there objective measures that we can use to prove or disprove some of these assumptions that go into these opinions? Finally, we're just going to talk about, our personal opinions and just implications for taking one opinion or the other. So yeah, not to really run away from our own thoughts on this, but we're going to be transparent here too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for us as Christians, and I think we've maybe said this in every single episode, as a body of believers, you might be sitting next to somebody with a polar opposite thought or opinion. I think we really need to be able to stop yelling at each other and actually think through things a little bit more critically. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ideas. I know you just mentioned our big idea and question is, was leaving Afghanistan the correct decision? And there's been a lot of talking points, and we're not political correspondents. However, it's important because I've seen it. I don't know if you've seen it on social media. Everybody's, maybe political spin or even just their approach and maybe even personal hurt to some of these images and videos and things like that we've been seeing.
Absolutely. I think, there's definitely two big opinions here. One is this was definitely the right time to leave. I think we've heard that definitely from our president. President Biden has definitely made sure to stand by his decision, and I'll commend him for standing behind his belief there. Opinion number two is, hey, this is the wrong time to leave, or this might have been the right time, but we're definitely leaving in the wrong way. So those are definitely the two sides to looking at this topic of leaving Afghanistan.
Yeah. And so now what we want to do is really break down some of those opinions and see the underlying assumptions within those opinions. So maybe we could just start there with the opinion that it was the right time to be in Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
what are some of those assumptions that you've been hearing?
No, definitely. And, I think for those of us that have been watching the news, we've definitely heard this from the president, other people in politics. And I think one of the big one of the big assumptions that's being made here is the government had, enough ability to fend off the Taliban threat for themselves. And even from The Guardian, I know some of these numbers have been debated, but at least tossed around, the Taliban force is about 80,000 people, whereas the Afghan military had a force of nearly 300,000. In addition, they were well equipped. We have been giving over 85 billion in aid to both train as well as equip the military in Afghanistan. So there's obviously, part number one is they should have been able to handle this.
Yeah, I mean, and that's pretty credible, right? When we think about it's the longest war in our country's history. There's people who have lived in America, probably some of our listeners who have never experienced our country not at war, which
Right.
is an incredible thing to think about. And so think about all that time that we've spent over there, and people feel that is definitely one of those reasons why maybe we should leave, or they are well equipped to handle it. So good points.
Yeah. And I think, one thing I heard from our president, which I also agree with, is, you can equip, but you cannot give the will to resist either. So there's a question of, hey, did it make a difference if we left today, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, would this have changed? And that's definitely a question that is up for debate, but one where I think, hey, if it's been 20 years and there isn't a will to defend for yourselves, I don't know when there will be.
Yeah, you know what? I was listening to a high-ranking government military advisor, I think on like an NPR podcast or something, and she was mentioning that, well, there's hundreds of thousands of Afghan military members that have died in this conflict. So how could we say that that's not the will to fight?
Sure.
So that's just kind of a pushback on Biden, and really to say, how could you even say that?
That's absolutely valid.
Yeah, but interesting. We'll get to that a little bit later. But what are some other assumptions that maybe you've heard from some folks?
Yeah, I think, another big assumption here is, well, why are we staying, right? Our objective, even in going to Afghanistan, and if we think about the beginning of the war, is to find and kill those that were responsible in perpetrating the 9/11 attacks and preventing another major attack on the United States soil. So if we look at just a list of leaders that we've seen killed since the beginning of this war, this includes the leaders of Al-Qaeda that were over the Arabian Peninsula, Maghreb, East Africa, and even the Indian subcontinent, including the co-founder of the group, as well as the potential successor for the group, which was Osama bin Laden's own son. And we all remember the day where Osama bin Laden was killed, and that was over 10 years ago at this point. So there's definitely a question of, why are we still there? And then two, by God's grace, there hasn't been another major attack on US soil, though we might have seen some minor ones here and there, but nothing on the scale of what we saw on September 11th.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. When you mentioned 10 years ago that Osama bin Laden was killed, I remember that day. It was my brother's birthday, and we all like ran in the middle of the street. We were just actually like cheering. It was like crazy. But I bet you have family and friends who have served in the military. I know I do. And one of the inspirations to even sign up was because of September 11th. And I know we're approaching the 20th anniversary. So there's been a lot of progress that's been made in this 20 years, but interesting data to show some of the success.
And I think there is still a third argument here for, it's the right time to leave. And that is the human toll to, just our American citizens here as well. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. And if we're just talking about Afghanistan specifically, not bringing, the war in Iraq into equation, over 2,200 US military have died in combat. We have over 3,800 US contractors that have passed away in Afghanistan, and over 400 US humanitarian workers that have also died in Afghanistan. And that's being reported, from the University of Brown Education Department. But that's not just, I feel like that's only the tip of the iceberg, because one point that I didn't consider is if we start looking at how many of our veterans that served in Iraq and Afghanistan died, there's over 30,000 suicides that our military members and veterans, have died, unfortunately. And those are people that served in these wars. So, the 2,200 number I know has been floated around, but it's just the tip of the iceberg to the human cost to American citizens here.
Yeah. And I think it's it's easy to jump into like whatever your political party says, and I'm going to go side with them. But there is a human element to this. And I think that's why we have to have this conversation as Christians. You might not be talking about this on a Sunday morning, but maybe you should. Maybe you
Right.
should be having these conversations within your small groups, and like, because there is a human element, and those veterans come back, and they're supposed to be a part of our communities as well.
Yeah.
So
100%. And
yeah.
it's hard because you can see those numbers and that thought and kind of go either way with it. On one side, you can say, hey, we should have ensured stability in the region because I don't want to feel like that was in vain. And the flip side, which we've also heard, which is, hey, we don't want to see more of our young men and women die being in part of this conflict, which we've had for over 2 decades at this point.
Yeah, and it's incredibly sad. I know we recently just saw the attack on the Kabul airport, and we lost service members and lots of civilians as well in Afghanistan, and it's heart-wrenching. I think if you're a Christian, your heart has to break, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So we've kind of talked about some of those assumptions there. I think there's just kind of another perspective where people say it was the wrong time to leave Afghanistan. Or it was just the wrong way to even leave the country. So definitely a polar opposite perspective. So what have you kind of seen with the assumptions on that end?
Yeah, one of the biggest things here is we talked about how well equipped the Afghanistan military was, but unfortunately, that also means we have left so much weaponry and allowed it to go to the wrong hands in order to oppress more people here. We're looking at some numbers that it came out of a Forbes article, and just between 2003 and 2016, we're not considering the last 5 years, but just considering 2003 to 2016, we have left over 75,000 vehicles behind, including 22,000 Humvees and 190 tanks. We have left over 200 aircrafts behind, including 110 helicopters and 20 attack planes. And we have left over 600,000 guns, including 350,000 assault rifles, 64,000 machine guns, and 9,800 rocket launchers in the region.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy when you think about the numbers and see that. I think I saw a stat where Afghanistan has more Black Hawk helicopters than 85% of the countries in the world.
Yep.
Which is,
I saw that as well. And, one of the sad things is I remember in our history classes, learning about different conflicts that arose because of the Cold War. And sometimes you look at some of these weapons today and you wonder, how did these groups even arrive with these weapons? And you realize, hey, these were just left over from conflicts that we stopped caring about. And now it was in the wrong hands and used to do the wrong things toward people. So you can only imagine, what is this going to be used for going into the future?
Yeah. Do we just create more problems? And we don't want to have a checklist and say, we accomplished this and we got out of Afghanistan, we ended the war. No, the world doesn't work that way. And but there's a lot of other assumptions as well, where people felt like, hey, this was not the right way to exit. What are some of those other things that you've been hearing?
Well, one of the divisive, things here is, what was our objective? I think on one side, we said, hey, the objective was to find those that perpetrated the 9/11 attacks and make sure we diminish the ability for a major attack to happen on U.S. soil again. But, citing a 2001 speech by Laura Bush, our former First Lady, the Washington Post, brought to light, or once again reminded us, that she even said one of the objectives here was to fight oppression on women and children in Afghanistan. And, we saw just, how many opportunities have occurred for women and children in the area over the last 20 years. I was reading one stat where the labor participation rate for women over the course of the last 20 years increased by 1.6 million people.
Wow.
Those opportunities there, being able to go to school, have diplomas, get an education, college degrees for the first time, is now almost in the blink of an eye completely gone.
Yeah, it's so sad. And I feel like that's been some of the heart-wrenching things that we've been seeing in the news, right? Like girls going to school just to say goodbye to their classmates that they'll never see again. And it's incredible with the babies over the walls, and it's really heart-wrenching to see that. And it does call into question, what was our point, in being there?
Right.
And then at the same time, did we already accomplish what we set out to do?
Yeah. And if we're going to talk about, the other effects that this is having on women in the region, it's more than heart-wrenching. You're seeing businesses that were centered around females being burned, destroyed. There are so many reports of women just destroying their diplomas just so that no one knows that they got an education. There are so many reports of people that are being, forcibly exited from the workplace. You're seeing women being taken as sex slaves or being forced into marriage with, Taliban quote unquote victors, and reports of some of them being as young as 12. This is unimaginable. Honestly, it's unimaginable. I can't fathom this.
Yeah. Yeah. I know we have listeners who have taken like mission trips and have gone to other parts of the world. And sometimes we take it for granted what we have in this country, but like, man, to see what could actually happen, like people can actually live in a society like that where your children are taken away from you and your life is completely uprooted. It's ridiculous, honestly.
Yeah.
I think there is another assumption here where people feel like, hey, the job's not done, right? And we are creating problems if we leave. What's some of those other assumptions that you've seen out there?
Yeah. And finally, I think, there is a moral responsibility on our end to stay and make sure that there is stability. After going in and destabilizing an entire region, we have to ensure that there is stability so that worse things don't occur. For example, we have tens of thousands of Afghanistanis who are now stranded. I know that there's still a subset of Americans that are stranded over there. I think The Hill reported that there's still over 200 American citizens left in Afghanistan after the last rescue plane had flown out. There are over 18,000 pending applications to come over to the US based on special immigrant visas. Now, these are for Afghanistanis that were helping the US military. These are not counted in the refugee population. These are special visas. And now there's an inevitable mass migration due to the instability within Afghanistan that will happen. And that's just a countless number of people. There's no way to give a number to that.
Yeah, it's unfathomable. I've read some articles where there's some Americans who are choosing to stay, where they have family there and they want to stay with them. And so there's some folks who are staying there by choice, but at the same time, not everybody got out, right?
Sure.
And there was a deadline in place and that was not met. I know folks have been criticizing things when you try to ask questions to the president or, the press secretary, and it's just like, well, look at the number that we did rescue. And it is a large amount. It is impressive when you see that. But I think at the same time, the concern is what about the people who are still left behind, right?
Right. And even if you think about our military's motto, right, no man left behind, does that not apply to our own citizens here?
Yeah. Yeah. And the folks that have dedicated their lives hoping for a better result at the end of this war, right? Like, helping and supporting and it's sad all around. So those are some of the assumptions, right? That, people have made whether we should stay or whether we should go. And I think there's nuance to these conversations. So we're not saying this is a black and white, pick and choose which side you should be on.
Right.
But it's such a complicated thing. And there's been plenty of people who were in charge during this 20-year war.
Yeah.
And I've lived through all of it. I'm old enough to say that. And I do remember a lot of it. And I think us as a church, no matter what side you fall on, I think we'll have our personal opinions on this. And there's also implications for us as a body of believers too, right? So how do you feel about that, Jeswin? What are some of those, hearing some of these stats, critically thinking through the opinions and assumptions, how do you come to some personal opinions about this?
Yeah. Jobbin, to be honest, this is probably one where I am so torn as to what the right move here was. I think sometimes we think of, being the president might be a glamorous position, but I also realize, hey, this is one of the toughest jobs, and you're going to make calls that you have to stand behind that have incredible implications.
Yeah.
And on that token, I see the fact that I don't know if staying another 10 years would have changed the inevitable outcome of a Taliban takeover at the end of the day. I think I'm more in the camp of we should have been a little bit more responsible in how we exited to ensure, our allies and those on the ground that we could have taken with us were saved, and making sure that our military equipment did not fall into the wrong hands. I think that is a big one here, personally on the subject. But now we're thinking implications for the church. I know, we might all be wrestling through this, but I think we ought to have broad consensus on praying about the situation, because there are lives at stake. I think one thing that we think about is, we're not just a local body. We have to care about the universal body of Christ. And too often we're just in our bubbles caring about our small group, our church politics, right? In different elements. But we forget that, hey, there's Christians in Afghanistan right now that don't know if they're going to see tomorrow because of the exit of the US and the taking over by the Taliban and giving them notice that you're essentially going to be killed for your faith.
Yeah.
And that is something we have to care about as the body of Christ, period. There should be no debate about that.
Yeah, there's like I think you brought up a really good point about sometimes we think about ourselves as just the local church and your friends, your community. Where are you guys meeting for small group this week? And what are you going to do on this weekend? But there is a global church that we should be thinking about. And I think without knowing their names and without knowing who they are and what their interests are, what you have in common with them, you do have something in common with them, that you profess your faith in Jesus Christ and you're part of that body. And how do we help them out? How do we support those folks? I saw a journalist post this update about the states in the US that are accepting Afghan refugees. And there's only 2 states, Wyoming and South Dakota, that said no.
Wow.
So the overwhelming majority of the states have offered to accept refugees. And I know that could be a whole nother conversation as well.
Sure.
But yeah, we really have to be thinking through the community and global church aspect of this, regardless of what your political affiliation is, right?
Yeah, and just to even bring it a little bit more close to home, I'm glad that you brought that up, Jobbin, that the majority of our states are accepting refugees, and regardless of, just like you said, that might be a conversation in and of itself. But I recall at the beginning when this war began, our church here out in Darien, it was called Heartsong, a very loving place. But there were Afghan refugees at our doorstep, literally brought to the apartment complex across from our church. And incredibly, it's something that's always etched into my mind. Our church decided to make a connection with them and see how we can support them. I remember going to this small 2-bedroom apartment with 10 people that lived there, right? Like a grandmother, her, 2 daughters, 2 sons, some of their spouses, all being there and just helping them with different things, right? Like learning English grammar, where hey, I might have been in elementary school, but it's interesting to try to teach that to someone that's learning this as a second language in their 20s, or even just breaking bread with them, sharing meal with them. I remember my parents, God bless both of them, they invited the entire family over to our house on my 10th birthday, just so that we can celebrate that together. And by God's grace, I think they're doing well now and on their feet. But this is an incredible opportunity for the church to be the church in a unique way, more than any other time, I guess, in our ability and in our history. So hopefully we can take advantage of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's amazing how God weaves those stories into our lives and our paths, and something that's happening across the world can happen across the street and impact you as a family. That's really cool to hear, Jeswin. And I know your parents have a loving heart to open up their doors, and I hope we can all mimic that. When we talk about personal opinions, to me, I think one of the most heart-wrenching things that I saw, was that, the video of the plane and folks hanging off the plane.
Yeah.
And man, that really triggered my memory, because I'm a little bit older, and I can I do remember very clearly when I was in high school when 9/11 happened. And that evening, going to my part-time job, and we still had to work, and we turned on the TV to see folks. That was like the first time I saw folks actually pass away live on like TV, and man, that airplane, when I saw that, it was just like, that really broke my heart, and it really brought me back, because, when I was like 18, That's when 9/11 happened. So you can calculate my age. But like, that's when a lot of my friends signed up to go to the military, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember writing letters to my friends who were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan and stuff like that, and like not knowing if I'll ever see you come back. I still have some of those letters, but it's like, man, you think about our servicemen and women who went out there to dedicate their lives. I start thinking about my high school buddies and, you know, like you mentioned, even just the toll it takes on them to say, hey, did I just spend half my life for nothing? You know, and it's incredible to think about that. And for us to like pick political parties, because I would say, you know, I see a lot of polarized conversation on this where like, hey, Biden, horrible. And then we don't criticize Trump when he left the Kurds, you know, a couple of years ago when Turkey was attacking. And it's like, we kind of pick and choose some of our political affiliations and not really looking at what happened within the context of that country and the situation and the people. We don't think about it critically, right? And we sometimes we kind of let our political parties dictate how we should be serving others. And I think that's the scariest part is when we let politics interfere with the call of what Jesus has called us to do, to open up our homes and our hearts to fellow communities and believers.
Wow.
So.
No, that's really, really such a good thought, bro. That's something hopefully everyone here that's listening takes to heart. And honestly, you know, one thing that I was thinking of as well is you realize the world that we live in is kind of what the Bible says. It's not the best place, and it's only going to get worse. I mean, you think about, you know, not just Afghanistan, that's probably only one region of how many around this world that is suffering, right? For between wars, between, you know, what they might hold for their faith. And you realize, you know, we're blessed to be here. We're blessed to have this conversation right now and even be able to hold different opinions from what the government tells you your opinion has to be. We are in a country where honestly, we are privileged to be here. If there's one privilege that we hold, it is American privilege. And it's one that, you know, once again, like you said, we have to thank our American service men and women, regardless of where we stand on this issue, for giving us the ability to have a country like this. Yeah,
I mean, well said. And I think we don't do it enough. And I think we have to honor those folks for what they do. And, you know, and I don't want to scapegoat around like my opinion on this, because I've seen some of the polarized conversations around this to say, hey, this is Biden's fault, or hey, this is Trump's fault. It's this. You know, to be honest, I will say, if you're in charge, you should have a plan to exit. And if you're going to exit and make that decision, you should have a plan to get everybody out. Like, you know what I'm saying? I feel like I'm not going to pin this all on the president himself, but hey, you're responsible. You know, and I feel like there is some kind of, there's accountability that has to happen with that. And that has to, the same accountability we have to apply to not just the folks that we're fans of. It has to be across the board. I just want to say, especially for folks who are really charged up about this, especially younger people. I know when I was 18, we actually started this war in Afghanistan. And I know everybody's opinions was like, I hate Bush. You know, it was just like this really polarized thing. But we have to, and as I've gotten older, I've started to see, whoa, there's some there's like nuance and there's details and there's decisions and there's these processes. So you just can't say, I hate this person, or you know what I mean? We really have to think through things critically, look at the evidence, look at the opinions, look at the assumptions, and come to a really strong conclusion. And it could differ between your friends and family, but like, don't just be polarized about some of these things, even though they could be very emotional, like this topic is, right?
Yeah. You know, once again, just to reiterate one thing, I think, you know, regardless of how we stand on this particular issue of leaving Afghanistan, we all know that there's a human cost to this decision. And I would love to find ways for the church to help. And Jobbin, isn't there a way for our listeners to potentially contact us? And if you guys know a great way to get involved, I think, you know, I would love to be part of something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I know some great organizations are doing great work for the people of Afghanistan. I know International Rescue Committee, if you go to rescue.org, they have a great website and a donation section if you want to help. But we know that there's several other nonprofits and people who are actually doing credible work and validated work to ensure your donations go to the right place. So feel free to post it in the comments, or maybe we'll ask it on Instagram or something. But I feel like there are some great, organizations out there, and we can't just rely on somebody else to fix problems. Sometimes we have to be the hands and feet of Jesus ourselves and like go in and help as much as we can, whether that's opening up our doors, to refugees, or donating money, or whatever we can do to help to spread awareness, to have these conversations with each other, to stop arguing and start analyzing a little bit more as well. So, Jeswin, thank you so much for kind of talking through this with us and sharing a lot of good insight. And we just hope this inspires us, and not to bring down the mood, but really pray for Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan, our men and women of the military, and then along with just our churches, to be the light, to open up the doors, to really restore our cities, right? Restore our communities in the best way. So, Jeswin, thank you for being on, man.
Thanks for having me.